Hello and welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian. Today we are doing something that is outside of our format. We're having an interview with a very special guest who is here in Armenia, Professor William Schabas, who has joined us. I'd like to introduce Professor Schabas to our viewers. He is an international human rights and criminal law expert. He is a professor at Middlesex and Leiden universities. He has served as the head of the UN Gaza Commission and commissioner on the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He is considered the world expert on the law of genocide and international law. There are many other things that I can say about you, Professor Schabas, but we would need a few hours to get through them. Welcome to Armenia. Welcome to EVN Report. Thank you for taking the time. And you are also here taking part in an international symposium on transitional justice that is organized by the Zoryan Institute in collaboration with the American University of Armenia. And you are also a board member of the Zoryan Institute.
That's right.
And, you know, we went through what is being coined as the Velvet Revolution in Armenia this past spring, and there has been discussions of bringing transitional justice to Armenia. And this has led to a lot of conversation, if you will, in the sort of public discourse on social media platforms, because many people, including myself at first, don't really understand the concept of transitional justice. So let's start with a very sort of simplistic, if we may, explanation of what transitional justice is.
Well, it is a concept, as you said. It's a concept, and it's something that I think the term emerged in the early 1990s, and it was to deal with the types of mechanisms, some of them quite experimental at the time, that were being used in countries where important political and social transitions were taking place. So the cases then were the former Soviet republics in Eastern and Central Europe, the former dictatorships in Latin America, and South Africa, going from apartheid to a pluralist democracy. So in all of these different political environments, you had this common idea that they were breaking with the past, and that what would be unacceptable would be simply to wipe the slate clean and forget about the past and to move on. And that was the challenge. So it took different forms in different countries, and then, for example, in South Africa, it was very much of a political compromise. It was part of a kind of a peace agreement. It was a deal that was made between de Klerk and Mandela that if the whites didn't fight to hold on to power and agreed to have democratic elections, which then Mandela would win, that there wouldn't then be they wouldn't throw everybody in jail for the crime against humanity of apartheid. So that was like a peace agreement, really, that was made. In other cases, of course, there wasn't any peace agreement in Eastern and Central Europe. The new countries were formed, or there were political changes in the countries, and the question was what to do about the past. So since then, there have probably been things labeled transitional justice in dozens and dozens of countries. Every time there's this sort of change, like what you've gone through in Armenia, the discussion, the conversation is, what do we do about the past? Recognizing that the existing tools you have, criminal law, criminal courts, which are adequate to deal with a part of it, are not really up to it. First of all, maybe you can't prosecute everybody. Maybe there are just too many of them. Maybe also there are political problems with prosecuting everybody because they're just too entrenched in the system, and so you have to, like what we do in our personal relations sometimes, you have to forgive, and we say forgive and forget, but the idea is you can't just forget either. So you try to have some acknowledgement of the past without full-blown criminal prosecution.
Can we say, therefore, what is the ultimate goal of transitional justice? Is it punitive? Is it prosecution? Or is it forgiveness and reconciliation? Or is it both? I don't know.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. It's all of the above.
All of the above.
Well, it is in a way, because on the one hand, there's a recognition that victims are entitled to some kind of acknowledgement, if it's not full-blown criminal justice. Sometimes the victims not only want to see the perpetrators of the abuses that they were victims of thrown in jail for a while, they'd like to see them have their fingernails pulled out and be tortured as well, and we're not going to do that, obviously. But the victims have their own demands, and they have to be addressed, even if they can't be fully satisfied. But at the same, and so that's kind of the backward-looking part of it. That's the retributive part of it. And then the forward-looking part is that you're trying to move on. It's about the future. You want the society, everyone, you know, that's what a revolution is. You want to move on to something better than what you've had. And so you're trying to build something. And that has to involve not just delivering harsh justice, firm justice to perpetrators, but reconciling somehow. It's something they call in ordinary criminal justice, there's a notion called restorative justice, which is about bringing together victim and perpetrator, and that somehow out of that acknowledgement, out of that conversation between victim and perpetrator, you move forward. And so that's part of the notion too.
Have there been any instances where transitional justice has not been able to serve its ultimate goal or purpose? And let me sort of give a context to this. During the revolution in Armenia, the leader of the opposition then, who is now the prime minister, said that there will be no vendettas against, any, government, state officials who were to be found, colluding with any criminal elements or, in corruption. And so with the introduction of transitional justice, many people, again, I think it comes from a place of perhaps not understanding, or maybe, I don't know, that transitional justice was going to be used as a vendetta against former members of the ancien regime. Mm-hmm. Are there cases where transitional justice has done more harm than its intended good?
Part of the problem with this process is that after, and now we have, as I say, the mechanisms and the concept of transitional justice. It's about a quarter of a century now since we've been talking about it, and people look back in South Africa. It's the old thing of is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? People look at it and say, oh, it was a disaster, it didn't work. And then you say, well, yeah, maybe it didn't satisfy everyone, but South Africa's at peace. So if that's what you cherish, if that's what you value, that they actually went 25 years without a bloodbath, you'd say, seems to have been probably the glass is half full. But then there are people who are dissatisfied with it, people who say, they say, well, the reconciliation is not complete, it's not finished. I mean, I don't have to tell Armenians about reconciliation. That's their history, going back a century. And that can sometimes take a long time. Maybe it never happens even. So there are debates as well just about interpreting it at the end, whether as to how useful it is.
They interpret everything.
Well,
right?
yeah, but we're trying. Part of the problem, I mean, you mentioned lawyers, and that's my background. I'm a lawyer. I used to practice law actually in the courts, but before I became an academic. But lawyers tend to want rigid solutions. They want, we'll adopt the law, we'll apply the law, we'll punish people, we'll put them in jail, we'll fine them. And transitional justice is more flexible. It's inherently more flexible. And it recognizes that sometimes you have to blend the principles of justice with other things. This comes up in transitional justice when we talk about decisions not to punish people for crimes that clearly they committed. And that goes by this name of amnesty. So amnesty was once a cherished word of progressive people. That's why the great NGO is called Amnesty International. But today Amnesty International would tell you that they're against amnesties. They don't agree with amnesties because they want justice for victims and so on. It's actually more nuanced than that, but it is a problem, and there are political decisions that have to be taken finally. I say political, I mean policy decisions. Right. The people, their leaders, at some point, whoever is authoritative and responsible will decide we're not going to punish those people, or we're going to punish some people to a certain extent, and not to, or we're not going to punish some people at all. And those decisions they escape the legal framework. They have to. They're inherently of that nature.
Okay, so again, for someone like myself, and for many people like myself, I want to try to understand the mechanisms, and I understand that it's unique for each country, for each particular case. And again, we did not have large-scale systematic violations, so, I mean, we didn't have mass killings or genocide, clearly, in Armenia. We had systemic, deeply ingrained corruption that is now coming to the surface. And if we were to, if everybody were to be prosecuted and found to be guilty, then a lot of people would be in jail. Now, how does the mechanism work? Does transitional justice, does it serve as an oversight sort of thing of the national judicial system? Does it work concurrently? Because I think in the case of Rwanda, they had the Gacaca tribal courts, they had their own national courts, and then they had international tribunals. In a country that's transitioning from, let's say, a totalitarian or semi-autocratic system to democracy, how does it work?
Well, the sort of the default position would be simply they committed a crime, corruption was illegal. The acts of corruption, of theft, of fraud, were no doubt illegal throughout the history of Armenia. So there's criminal law that could deal with it. There'll be decisions taken. Most countries do this with economic and corruption-related crimes. They will say, look, we'll give you an amnesty if you give the money back, or some of it,
How much money, though?
Yeah.
But it depends on the...
Depends on the proportions, it depends on the likelihood of getting it back. It also depends, to a certain extent, when you're making that offer to someone, on the certainty that they actually will be punished if they don't give the money back. But you're saying to them, you make it simple for us, we'll make it simple for you. But this is done in every country. Most countries have for income tax fraud and stuff like that, they'll have an amnesty. But that's a question. I think one thing that makes it, in a way, easier in the Armenian context is, as you say, we're not dealing with people who were physical victims of violent crimes. And that's a much harder problem to deal with in a country like in South Africa, where someone says, you mean you're going to give that man an amnesty who beat my son to death? That's pretty hard for victims to accept and to swallow. And some of them didn't, and some were, deeply dissatisfied. And all the South Africans could say was, well, it's a trade-off for having a peaceful transition, and the collective good of peace has to come ahead of your own personal entitlement to see the perpetrator punished. But here, when these are crimes of corruption, where society, in a way, was the victim rather than individuals, and the whole nation suffered, in a way, from the corruption, I think in some ways that's easier to deal with. It's just a matter of, first of all, making the prospect of punishment threatening enough to the perpetrators that they will be prepared to give some money back. Of course, you could pardon them all too, and just say, we are going to wipe the slate clean. But I think when you talk of transitional justice here, that's not entirely acceptable either. People would find that unacceptable, that there are people with huge resources financially outside the country, and I suppose inside as well, who will get away with it, as long as they don't obviously do it again. I can't go beyond that in terms of, but there are some other things, let me just say, that are also parts of transitional justice that need to be addressed in this context. One of them is just the dealing with the past, the truth about the past and the entitlement to the truth, and that's what other types of mechanisms like truth commissions deal with. You had you say it's not large-scale massacre like in Rwanda, but there were the killings in 2008.
Which is what my next question was.
Okay, I'll leave you for the question.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
And then there's one other part of it that we haven't spoken about, which is what they call, sometimes it goes by the term lustration, which people, it's not a familiar term in English. People tend to use the term vetting. Vetting means you look at the existing civil service, universities, judiciary, and you realize there are some corrupt, bad people who don't belong there, and you figure out a way to get rid of them. And that's also challenging and difficult. It has its own problems, and maybe, particularly with judges, because you don't want to be cavalierly dismissing judges because it sets a bad precedent. Judges are supposed to have security, and that protects their independence and impartiality. And once you get in the habit of removing judges you don't agree with, you don't know where that will end. So
right, but in one of the articles that you had written, which I was reading with great interest, to be honest, because this is fascinating for me as well. You said, transitional justice can be introduced when the national justice system is able to try the accused but refuses to do so, which is a very likely scenario in Armenia, or when the national justice system is in such disarray that proper trial is practically impossible. If these two exist, then what do you do other than getting rid of the judges?
Yeah, well, part of that problem is deciding, how serious the disarray is. And often the problem is simply that you don't have enough talented, capable people to replace them all.
So what does it? In the case of Armenia, and I know you're not an expert.
Yeah.
In the Armenian case, I know you follow closely, but I don't mean to put you on the spot either. But let's say today they decide that they're going to remove 80% of the judges because of these reasons, and they have proof. Investigations have happened, and there aren't enough people to come and replace them.
Yeah.
What happens?
Well, what happens is you trade one chaotic situation for another. Yeah, I think. And so that's obviously, it's all in the detail about that. But there are one solution. In South Africa, finally, they just said, they have mandatory retirement. I forget at what age. They said, we're just going to let them die out, which was what they basically did.
Because sometimes your choices are limited.
Yeah, they are. And I think here you don't have a problem finding talented people with legal training who would have the sufficient credibility and independence and impartiality to replenish the ranks. I don't think that's a problem. In some countries it was. When I worked in Rwanda, after genocide in Rwanda, there just weren't people to do it. Right. So there are different types of solutions. You have fast-track training programs and try to get people up to speed. As I say, Rwanda was really a situation. Rwanda, many of the judges had been killed in the genocide, so it wasn't as if you had to get rid of them. There was nobody to get rid of anymore. But that is a problem, reforming the justice system, because and the vetting is part of the same problem. 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the new regime would come in and say, fire them all, take over. But we can't do that either, because the people you're vetting and the judges, they have rights too, and we have to. If you want to develop the rule of law, you can't do it by simply wiping out the existing system and starting fresh.
Victim of the system themselves in many ways, right? If the president allegedly or somebody in a very high-ranking position in politics was calling the judge and threatening him. They were also in some ways.
I think in most countries it ends up being a mix. After the Second World War, where no one used the term transitional justice, but there was a lot of it in Germany after the Second World War. You had international tribunals, you had national prosecutions, you had what they called denazification, which was kind of like vetting. They had a trial at Nuremberg of the judges. It's the one that's in the film, Judgment at Nuremberg, the famous old film, and it's sort of a fictionalized version of it. They had the judges showed up and they said to the prosecutors, they said, actually, we apply the law. That's what we did. We applied the Nazi law. You change the law, we can apply it. Just you can trust us. We don't care. We do. And the court said, no, not good enough. You applied a law that was so bad and foul that you are committing crimes against humanity yourself. But judges often in a system, they're, the problem is selecting the good ones, sorting out the good ones from the bad ones. There may be some obvious bad eggs, and maybe you can find a way to deal with them. But the problem is that if you is drawing the line, and who's going to do it, and you want to do it in such a way that the new people who come in don't feel it. Well, here's how they get rid of you. If I don't behave, they'll get rid of me too. Sure. And you don't want that. You want them to come in thinking, it'd be pretty hard to fire me as a judge.
Right.
That's the kind of judge you want.
Right. And for them to also remember what happened to the guy whose office they're sitting in now,
Yeah.
or the
yeah.
bench that they're sitting on.
So it's, you know, it's not, this is as much about art as science. It's not there aren't rigid formula for it. The other thing about transitional justice, I mean, you're here at a very early stage in Armenia, and this is something that evolves over time. There are countries, for example, that...
It's not like you can come in 3 months and, apply it and say, I tried my best kind of thing, right?
No, and things change. So in the Latin American dictatorships, the original plan was we'll give an amnesty to some of the dictators like Pinochet in Chile, and we won't have trials. And they did that, and then 25 years later, they said, actually, we've been thinking it wasn't such a great idea. So societies change and go back on it. The same happened in Germany after the war, where they say that the real impact on the German population of the transition was not the war crimes trials organized by the victorious Allies in the years that immediately followed it, but the German trials that took place in the 1960s, 20 years later. So these things take time as well to do. They don't, and as I say, they get revisited. So many countries, there's some countries that had 2 truth commissions. Chile had 2. They had one in about 1990. It was a step forward. It was an advance. And then more than a decade later, they said, I think we better have another one. So that will happen. That will happen here too. You'll see, part of it is how deep the wounds are, how serious the problems are, how you correct it. And, then as I say, there are some countries that haven't really done it at all. Spain is an example. Spain had 30, 40 years of dictatorship under Franco, a terrible civil war, and they said, we're going to move on, and they did. And there's still, rumbling in Spain about dissatisfaction about that, but there's also a pretty broad consensus that actually maybe we better not upset the process. And, Spain is a healthy, modern democracy with all of its flaws, but it's not bad given its past. And so there are a lot of models to choose from as well. And finally, it's a combination. Maybe there's an Armenian way that you'll find, and then 10 or 15 years from now, people will say they did it the right way. Maybe
that's a very interesting thing. And just a final question, talking about deep wounds, not to end on this kind of a note, but this is why we're talking about it, because of these wounds, really. And it's March 1, 2008, as you mentioned, when 10 people were killed, when security forces cracked down on peaceful demonstrators. It was post-election time, and to date, 10 years later, no one has been held accountable for that. And this has been a common narrative for the past 10 years about we call it Marti Mek, March 1. Oh. Can we again? I'm supposing we can apply transitional justice.
I don't want to be prescriptive about what you should do here in Armenia. I come with my knowledge and experience in other places. But if there's one obvious case where you should do something, it's that massacre in 2008. It's too important to the history of the country. I think there are parallels of this. So one of them is in the United Kingdom, where there was a massacre, in many ways quite comparable, in 1971 in Derry, in Northern Ireland, and I think there were 14 people who were killed in a demonstration that the demonstrators said was peaceful. The British troops were there. They opened fire. People were shot. There was a kind of an unsatisfactory inquiry that happened after, and there was impunity. It basically gave a blessing, a clean bill of health to the British troops. And that was a wound in the country that lasted for many, many years. And finally, they had another inquiry into it 30 years later. You could do that. You could definitely have an inquiry into it, and it might lead to the recommendation that there be prosecutions. It might identify suspects, and then that could be done. I think that the victims are entitled to justice for that. Their families, their loved ones are entitled to have that clarified and elucidated. And so I mean, I think that's a fairly straightforward one, and there are many models for it, and you'll just have to determine the proper way to go about doing it. It could either be just simply say, there's no amnesty for this, give it to the prosecutor, and do it. And the other thing might be to start with an inquiry. An inquiry might be helpful too, because it could dig into the truth of it and get some clarity about what happened, about what the events were, while you're kind of repairing the justice system. Because maybe saying we'll have it dealt with by the criminal justice system, that's not a great solution, since they've had 10 years to deal with it and haven't done it. Mm-hmm. So maybe you need to prepare the groundwork for that. So an inquiry is a good way to do that, and many countries proceed in that way. It's not unlike, it's kind of analogous to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission approach, which was done in South Africa. There was one in Sierra Leone that I was a member of, a Truth Commission, and it's it avoids some of the limitations of criminal justice, and it also enables you to get a broader truth about what happened. And I think that probably what people want to know about that, about the killings at the demonstration, is not just who pulled the trigger, and were they ordered to do it, and what were the circumstances, and what were they targeting, but the broader context of what was going on, and how did it happen in this country that a peaceful protest ended in bloodshed. And to get to that broader truth, a public inquiry is a pretty good instrument, a pretty good mechanism.
Well, Professor Schabas, thank you for this fascinating conversation. I wish we could talk some more, but you shed light, I think, for many of us to try and understand the concept of transitional justice, and perhaps we can find the Armenian way of implementing it in our own countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.